Snow fell like a curtain over the endless frontier, silencing forests and rivers alike. For pioneers, this was no romantic winter wonderland. It was a merciless trial by ice. Families who had dreamed of fertile lands and new beginnings soon found themselves trapped in frozen cabins, their food dwindling, their bodies weakening, and their minds unraveling. Wolves circled at night, frostbite gnawed at flesh, and hunger carved away at hope. This is not the story of adventure painted in textbooks. This is the untold reality of survival, the frozen trails, and the starving camps. The early decades of the 19th century in North America carried a powerful sense of motion. Across the eastern seaboard, cities were swelling with immigrants and young families seeking land, opportunity, and the promise of independence. Farther west, rumors spread of fertile valleys, endless forests, and prairies rich with soil. The frontier called to restless men and women, not only as a destination, but as an idea, a place where one could escape debt, rigid social hierarchies, or the crowded conditions of industrializing towns. The dream of the frontier was deeply tied to freedom, land ownership, and the hope of building something lasting. But the journey west was never as simple as a wagon rolling toward the horizon. Between these dreams and their fulfillment lay some of the harshest winters settlers had ever endured. Entire communities faced starvation, frostbite, and death. To understand how those winters shaped the realities of frontier life, we first need to understand why so many willingly chose such peril in the first place. By the turn of the 1800s, the young United States had doubled in size through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. This massive acquisition, brokered by President Thomas Jefferson, added over 800,000 square miles of territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. To many Americans, this was more than land, it was a new future. Land that had been unaffordable or unattainable in the East could now be claimed, cleared, and cultivated. Ownership of farmland meant self-sufficiency, wealth, and for some, a sense of divine mission. The concept of manifest destiny would not be formally articulated until the 1840s, but the spirit of it already lived in the hearts of settlers decades before. The federal government encouraged this movement. Legislation like the Land Act of 1820 made it possible for small farmers to purchase land cheaply. Later, the Preemption Act of 1841 and eventually the Homestead Act of 1862 gave settlers rights to occupy and improve land before officially purchasing it. For many, these policies promised what Europe could not: the ability for ordinary people, not just elites, to own productive farmland. But if cheap land was the incentive, economic pressure was the push. Eastern states faced cycles of financial panic, unemployment, and agricultural collapse. The Panic of 1819, the first major economic crisis in US history, devastated countless families, forcing them to seek a new beginning. Land speculation, debts, and failing harvests drove entire groups to abandon the East westward. They believed lay escape and renewal. The dream, however, carried a harsher reality. Winter on the frontier was not the mild seasonal shift familiar to farmers in temperate regions. For those who crossed the Alleghenies into Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, or later pressed into Minnesota, Iowa, and the Dakotas, the winters were long, bitter, and merciless. Many came from places with shorter cold seasons and had little understanding of how to endure months of sub-zero temperatures, ice storms, and blizzards in their letters and diaries. Settlers often described their astonishment at the cold. In Wisconsin Territory during the winter of 1836 to 37, New arrivals wrote of rivers freezing solid enough to carry teams of oxen, and of snow piling so high that cabins disappeared beneath drifts. Others, in the Dakota Territory during the 1860s, reported temperatures plunging to 40 degrees below zero for weeks at a time. Few pioneers arrived fully prepared for such conditions. Part of the struggle lay in timing. Many settlers reached their chosen land in late autumn, too late to build adequate cabins, cut enough firewood, or plant crops. They entered their first winters in temporary shelters or unfinished log homes, with little insulation against the howling winds. The romantic vision of fertile acres quickly gave way to the grim reality of surviving night after night with dwindling food supplies. The human motivations that fueled these journeys were as varied as the hardships. Some settlers were immigrants fleeing famine, like the Irish families who came westward after the 1840s potato blight. Others were religious communities, such as German Anabaptists and Scandinavians, who sought both farmland and freedom to practice their beliefs. African American settlers, both freedmen and later exodusters in the late 19th century, looked west for refuge from racial oppression and the chance to live on their own land. Each group carried hopes specific to its circumstances, yet all were united by the same struggle against the frontier's winters. The clash between expectation and environment was stark. Guides and promoters had painted the frontier as a paradise of abundance, often minimizing or ignoring its seasonal brutality. Land companies distributed pamphlets that spoke of rich soil and open skies, but rarely mentioned starvation, frostbite, or blizzards. Newcomers soon realized that survival required far more than determination. It demanded knowledge, skill, and luck. Communities sometimes organized to share resources during these early winters. In Minnesota during the late 1850s, Scandinavian settlers developed traditions of mutual aid, pooling food and fuel among families to ensure that the weakest did not perish. Yet in other cases, isolation proved deadly. Families who settled far from neighbors could be snowed in for months, unable to seek help. Hunger gnawed at both body and spirit, and diaries from these winters often turned from hopeful descriptions of farmland to grim inventories of dwindling supplies. For many, the first winter determined whether their dreams of the frontier would endure or collapse. Some abandoned their claims altogether, returning east in defeat. Others clung to their land, enduring unspeakable hardships in the belief that spring would reward their suffering. The stories of those who persevered, who carved homes, communities, and farms from frost and hunger, became part of the larger mythology of pioneer resilience. Yet beneath that mythology lay a harsher truth. The price of survival was staggering. As the frontier pushed farther west, into the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain territories, the pattern repeated. Promises of land and independence drew thousands into environments they scarcely understood. Winter after winter, settlers tested themselves against conditions that no romantic vision could soften. The dreams carved in frost were often dreams carved in suffering, endurance, and loss. And though many would survive, their survival came at the cost of innocence. The frontier was not simply a place of opportunity, it was a crucible of survival. By the middle of the 19th century, the westward migration was no longer a trickle but a flood. Families, young couples, and entire communities packed their belongings, loaded wagons, and began journeys that stretched hundreds, even thousands of miles. These were not small relocations. They were monumental acts of endurance, one-way marches into landscapes few of them had ever seen, through climates few of them understood, For many, the road began in Missouri, Illinois, or Iowa. These borderlands became the staging grounds of the frontier. Towns like Independence, St. Joseph, and Council Bluffs transformed into outfitting hubs where wagons were repaired, oxen purchased, and barrels of flour, bacon, and coffee loaded onto carts. From these places radiated the arteries of the great migrations: the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail, and countless lesser-known paths that settlers forged themselves. The Oregon Trail, stretching over 2,000 miles from Missouri to the fertile Willamette Valley, carried more than 400,000 emigrants between the 1830s and 1860s. The Mormon Trail, carved by religious refugees seeking sanctuary in the Salt Lake Valley, stretched more than 1,300 miles across prairies and mountains. The California Trail, splintering from the Oregon route, became a highway of dreams after the discovery of gold in 1848. Each of these journeys represented more than distance. They represented risk, the surrender of security for an uncertain promise. The very act of departure was monumental. Most settlers knew they would never return east. Letters to loved ones became rare, sometimes impossible, as communication lagged months behind. Once a wagon train set out, it was committed. Families sold farms, abandoned towns, and left behind graves of ancestors, all in the hope that the lands ahead would repay the sacrifice. The march into the unknown was not taken lightly. Preparations required weeks, even months. Guides recommended that each family bring at least 200 pounds of flour, 75 pounds of bacon, 25 pounds of sugar, and essential tools for repair. Yet no amount of preparation could account for the realities of the trail. Wagons broke under strain. Oxen fell sick. Streams turned into torrents. And every day carried the same unrelenting rhythm: walk, drive the wagons, ford rivers, set camp, cook over fires, rest, and begin again. The pace was grueling. Travelers often walked more than 15 miles a day for months at a time, rarely riding in the wagons, which were reserved for children, the sick, or supplies. The prairie sun scorched them in summer, while winds cut through clothing in autumn. Dust rose in choking clouds, and when rain came, the ground turned into a sucking mire that swallowed wheels and shoes alike. Disease was the silent killer. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and measles claimed far more lives than accidents or attacks. Cholera epidemics swept through wagon trains in the 1840s and 1850s, killing thousands in a matter of hours or days. Families were forced to bury loved ones by the side of the trail, sometimes within sight of other travelers who dared not stop for fear of contagion. By some estimates, 1 in 10 who set out on the Oregon Trail never reached their destination. Accidents added to the toll. Wagons rolled over when crossing rivers. Children fell beneath wheels. Firearms, carried for hunting or protection, discharged unexpectedly. The journals of emigrants record endless funerals, small mounds of earth marked with crude wooden crosses, sometimes stripped bare by wolves within days. Each grave was a reminder that the trail was not merely a road to opportunity, but a gauntlet of survival for the Mormon pioneers. The long march carried the added burden of religious exile. Driven from their homes in Missouri and Illinois by waves of violence, they set their sights on the distant Salt Lake Valley. Between 1846 and 1869, more than 70,000 Latter-day Saints made the journey, many with handcarts rather than full wagons, pulling their belongings across plains and mountains by sheer muscle power. They embodied the desperation and determination of those who believed the West was their only refuge. As settlers moved farther west, the terrain grew more unforgiving. The prairies gave way to the Rocky Mountains, whose snow-capped peaks loomed like walls. Wagon trains were forced to ascend steep passes where animals slipped and wagons splintered. In the Sierra Nevada and the Cascades, snow could trap entire groups, as famously happened to the Donner Party in the winter of 1846 to 47. They were stranded by early blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, with starvation driving them to desperate measures. Though extreme, their ordeal was not unique in revealing the razor-thin margins settlers lived upon when the cold set in. The march into the unknown was not only a physical struggle, but a cultural crossing. Settlers passed through lands long inhabited by indigenous nations. Some encounters were peaceful, trade, guidance, or shared aid. Others turned violent, as mistrust and the pressure of encroachment sparked conflict. For emigrants, the presence of native peoples added another layer of uncertainty to journeys already defined by risk. Winter haunted every mile of these treks. Those who departed too late in the season risked being trapped in mountain passes or caught in blizzards on the plains. Diaries recount wagons stalled by snowdrifts, families huddling under canvas covers as temperatures dropped far below freezing, and livestock dying in droves. The decision of when to leave was a matter of life and death. Too early, and spring floods made rivers impassable. Too late, and winter descended before mountains could be crossed. In the end, the march into the unknown was a crucible. It forged some of the most enduring stories of American expansion, but at a staggering cost. For every tale of fertile valleys and new beginnings, there were countless graves along the trails, silent testimonies to the gamble settlers took. Their journeys carved a new nation across the continent, but they did so in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And as winter descended on those trails, the dreams carried westward froze into the stark realities of survival. For settlers who crossed rivers, prairies, and mountains in search of fertile land, there was one enemy more relentless than any storm, any hunger, or any isolation: the winter itself. Unlike the cycles of rain or drought, which came with some warning, winter on the frontier could arrive suddenly, without mercy, and with consequences that determined whether entire families lived or perished. The stories of these winters echo through the records of diaries, newspapers, and government reports. They reveal how the seasons punished those who underestimated them, and how even the most prepared could be caught off guard. In the winter of 1836 to 37, the Wisconsin Territory, still sparsely settled, endured one of its most severe seasons. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, while snow piled up in drifts that swallowed cabins to their rooftops. Settlers described rivers freezing solid enough to bear heavy wagons, yet the cold made firewood scarce, as axes splintered and hands stiffened in the bitter winds. Those who had arrived late in the autumn, with little time to prepare, found themselves trapped in makeshift shelters. Food stores spoiled, flour barrels ran dry, and hunters returned empty-handed as game disappeared into deep snow. Survival became a daily calculation of what could be stretched one more day farther west. In the Dakota Territory, winters during the 1860s and 1870s reached legendary severity. Diaries and county records describe weeks where temperatures remained 30 to 40 degrees below zero. Blizzards, driven by winds that howled across the open plains, buried homes, animals, and people alike. Unlike forests where trees offered both shelter and firewood, the treeless prairies left settlers exposed. Families burned, twisted hay, corn husks, or even furniture to keep fires alive. These conditions tested not only endurance but ingenuity, forcing settlers to adapt or succumb. For wagon trains still on the move, an early winter could mean catastrophe. The Donner Party, remembered for the desperation of cannibalism in the Sierra Nevada during the winter of 1846 to 47, is only the most infamous example. Their ordeal began when heavy snows arrived early, trapping them in mountain passes before they could reach California's lower valleys. Diaries from the survivors record snow depths of over 20 feet, oxen dying in their tracks, and people reduced to chewing leather straps when food was gone. Though extreme, the Donner Party's fate illustrated the risks that every westward migrant carried when timing slipped against them. Even those who successfully reached their land faced the brutal learning curve of northern winters. In Minnesota during the 1850s, Scandinavian immigrants, experienced with cold climates, often fared better than others. Yet even they recorded hardships. In one letter home, a Swedish settler warned relatives not to come unless they were ready to endure hunger and frostbite, noting that one bad season could erase years of effort. For settlers from milder climates, Germans from the Rhineland, Irish fleeing famine, or American farmers from the mid-Atlantic, the winter was a new and merciless teacher. The physical effects of the cold were devastating. Hypothermia struck quickly during blizzards, when winds stripped away body heat faster than fires could restore it. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and ears, leaving permanent scars even on survivors. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable, their weakened bodies unable to withstand long nights of sub-zero temperatures. For every dramatic account of survival, there were countless quiet tragedies. Families found frozen in their cabins come spring. Neighbors who disappeared during storms and were never seen again. The psychological toll was equally severe. Winter was not only a season of cold, but of isolation. Snowbound families could go months without seeing neighbors, cut off from community and trade. Loneliness magnified despair. One settler in Iowa recorded that his family survived an entire winter on little more than cornmeal and hope. While the silence of snow became heavier than stone, relief rarely came quickly. Government support was minimal, and supplies often failed to reach remote settlements in time. In 1882-81, the upper Midwest endured what became known as the hard winter. Blizzards swept across Nebraska, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, collapsing barns, freezing livestock, and cutting railroads for months. Trains carrying food and coal were halted by snowdrifts that reached rooftops. Families resorted to grinding seed wheat, meant for spring planting, into flour to survive. Newspapers from Minnesota described citizens cutting blocks of frozen hay to burn as coal deliveries never arrived. This was not the romanticized frontier of open skies, but a stark reminder that nature remained firmly in control. For indigenous peoples of the plains and upper Midwest, winters had always been a season of calculated endurance. Lakota, Dakota, and Ojibwe communities developed traditions of preserving meat, fish, and wild rice, insulating lodges, and moving seasonally to more sheltered regions. But the arrival of settlers disrupted these lifeways. Hunting grounds diminished, bison herds collapsed under commercial hunting, and traditional patterns of movement were restricted. As a result, indigenous communities also suffered under the same merciless winters, now compounded by the pressures of displacement and scarcity. Their survival knowledge was profound, yet it too was strained as resources dwindled. For all who lived on the frontier, Winter struck as a reminder that human plans were fragile. Hopes of fertile harvests, of new towns, of prosperity and freedom could be frozen in place overnight by a storm. Settlers learned, often through devastating loss, that preparation was everything. Adequate shelter, sufficient firewood, and preserved food were not luxuries but the only defense against months of unyielding cold. The stories of these winters became part of the collective memory of the frontier. They were retold in letters, memoirs, and local histories, not to romanticize suffering, but to underscore resilience. Yet beneath the pride of survival remained the sobering truth. Winter on the frontier was indifferent, sudden, and often merciless. It did not bend to hope or determination. It demanded respect, preparation, and sacrifice. When winter struck without mercy, it tested not only bodies but entire communities. Some endured, others disappeared into the silence of snow. And in their struggles, the line between dream and nightmare, between promise and peril, was drawn not by the land itself, but by the seasons that ruled it. For settlers on the frontier, winter survival often came down to two questions. Could you build a shelter strong enough to withstand the winds? And could you cut enough fuel to keep a fire burning until spring? Every family who dared the wilderness learned quickly that shelter and firewood were not conveniences. They were life itself. When pioneers arrived in the Great Lakes region, the northern plains, or the mountain valleys, most had only weeks, sometimes days, to prepare for their first winter. The most fortunate arrived in spring or early summer, giving them time to clear land, raise cabins, and stockpile wood. But many reached their claims in late autumn, after long journeys delayed by floods, broken wagons, or sick livestock. For them, the first winter became a desperate struggle in unfinished cabins, drafty dugouts, or tents that offered little against the cutting winds. The cabins themselves reflected both resourcefulness and urgency. In heavily wooded areas like Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin, settlers built log cabins by felling nearby trees. Without sawmills or nails, logs were notched and stacked, their gaps filled with a mixture of mud, clay, or moss called chinking. Roofs were often made of split shingles or even rough bark. The structures were crude, but they offered immediate protection from snow and rain. Yet a cabin was only as good as the fuel behind it. Families needed to cut and stack cords of firewood, often several tons before the first snow fell. Oak, hickory, and maple burned hot, while softer woods like pine and poplar vanished too quickly in the stove. Cutting firewood was grueling work, requiring hours each day with axe and saw. In the coldest months, a fire had to be kept alive day and night, consuming entire logs just to keep the frost from creeping through the walls. Settlers who miscalculated found themselves burning furniture, fence posts, or even the wooden shingles from their own roofs to survive. In treeless regions, the problem was worse. On the prairies of Iowa, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, settlers faced open expanses with little timber. Sod houses built from thick blocks of prairie turf became the solution. These sod homes, while crude and dark, provided insulation far superior to tents or hastily built wooden shacks. Thick earthen walls trapped heat, and when plastered with clay, they kept out the worst of the wind. But even the best sod house was useless without fuel. With trees scarce, settlers turned to alternative sources, twisting hay into bundles, burning corn cobs, or gathering dried buffalo chips. These substitutes produced little heat and much smoke, filling sod houses with choking fumes. Families rationed every scrap of burnable material, knowing that a single miscalculation could leave them freezing before spring. The desperation of firewood shortages appears again and again in historical records. During the infamous winter of 1880 to 81 in the Dakota Territory, known simply as the Hard Winter, blizzards sealed rail lines for months. Coal shipments never arrived. Settlers stripped fence rails, outbuildings, and barns to feed their stoves. One farmer recalled burning green willow branches, which hissed and spat but kept his children alive. Others tore pages from books and newspapers, feeding them to flames that flickered out within minutes. Shelter, too, was never guaranteed. Blizzards tore at roofs, collapsing weak cabins and burying dugouts. In Nebraska during the winter of 1856, newspapers reported families buried alive when snowdrifts sealed their homes, forcing neighbors to dig them out days later. In Minnesota, children froze to death inside poorly insulated cabins when fires went out during the night. The battle to keep roofs intact and fires burning was relentless. For immigrants, the shock of the frontier's demands was often overwhelming. Scandinavian families, though familiar with cold climates, were astonished by the lack of resources on the American prairie. Letters home to Norway and Sweden described winters where firewood was so scarce that settlers spent entire nights awake, feeding fires made of straw. German immigrants in Kansas recalled digging holes into hillsides to create dugouts, their ceilings dripping with condensation that froze into icicles indoors. The psychological weight of these conditions was heavy. To rise each morning knowing that hours of chopping wood stood between survival and freezing was exhausting. Women and children carried as much burden as men, hauling wood, twisting hay, and tending fires. Illness compounded the difficulty. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza struck families weakened by cold and smoke-filled shelters. Without proper medicine, many did not recover. Indigenous peoples had long mastered strategies for surviving northern winters, building lodges insulated with hides, preserving meat and wild rice, and moving to more sheltered regions during storms. But as settlers encroached, the availability of wood, game, and open land diminished. Native families faced their own crises, as treaties restricted movement and forced them into confined reservations with poor supplies. The hardships of shelter and fuel were shared, though settlers often overlooked the parallels. Despite the misery, there were lessons of endurance. Communities learned the importance of preparation, cooperation, and shared labor. Some organized woodcutting bees, where neighbors worked together to gather fuel for those least able. Churches, schools, and meeting halls became communal shelters when families' homes failed. Out of desperation grew traditions of mutual aid that helped entire communities weather the cold. Yet for every success story, there were tragedies. Historical records of counties across Minnesota, Dakota, and Wisconsin recount families found dead in their cabins when fires burned out. The silence of snow concealed losses until spring, when neighbors discovered what winter had taken. The dream of the frontier, rich farmland, independence, and opportunity was measured against the cost of survival. And more often than not, survival was purchased with desperation, with cabins of sod and smoke-filled dugouts, with furniture reduced to ash, and with days and nights consumed by the endless labor of firewood. Winter on the frontier was a test not of ambition, but of endurance. It stripped away illusions and demanded everything settlers had. Shelter and firewood were the fragile line between life and death, and when they failed, the frontier claimed its price. On the frontier, food was not simply nourishment. It was security, hope, and the fragile thread that tethered families to survival. Settlers could endure the cold with enough wood, and they could patch leaky cabins against the wind. But without food, all defenses crumbled. Winter after winter, the greatest fear was not wolves, nor storms, nor isolation. It was hunger. The westward migration forced families to plan meticulously. Before leaving towns like Independence, Missouri, or Council Bluffs, Iowa, emigrants loaded wagons with flour, bacon, beans, dried fruit, sugar, salt, and coffee. Guides urged each family to bring at least 1,000 pounds of provisions for the journey. Yet even with careful preparation, the trail itself consumed supplies. Oxen required feed, children grew sick, barrels spoiled in damp weather, and sacks of flour split open when wagons overturned in rivers. By the time many families reached their chosen land, their reserves were already depleted. The first year was always the hardest. New arrivals often had no crops stored, no root cellars, and no livestock fattened for slaughter. They depended entirely on what remained in their wagons and what little they could hunt or forage. In fertile regions like the Ohio Valley or Iowa, this sometimes proved enough. But farther north or west, when winters struck early, food vanished quickly. Diaries reveal the grim calculations settlers made as supplies dwindled. In Wisconsin during the winter of 1836 to 37, one farmer recorded his family living on cornmeal mixed with water, stretched into thin cakes that offered little sustenance. In Iowa Territory, settlers boiled beans again and again, reusing the water until it turned bitter. Families thinned flour with ground acorns or tree bark, desperate to make bread last longer. Hunger gnawed daily, and the smallest meal became an act of endurance. Hunting, though vital, was unreliable. In autumn, deer and elk filled forests and prairies, but as snow deepened, animals grew scarce. Many migrated or perished, leaving settlers with empty traps. In Dakota Territory, newcomers found that bison herds, once a dependable food source, had been driven to near extinction by commercial hunters and railroad expansion. The scarcity of game meant that those who had counted on hunting to supplement supplies faced starvation instead. Preservation techniques often failed in the brutal cold. Meat stored in poorly insulated smokehouses spoiled. Potatoes and root vegetables froze solid, turning to mush when thawed. Barrels of salted pork leaked, their brines seeping away. In Minnesota during the 1850s, immigrants wrote of entire winter stores destroyed by freezing rains that seeped into their cabins. With no recourse, families turned to whatever they could find. Dried kernels of corn meant for seed, or scraps of feed meant for animals. The psychological weight of hunger cannot be overstated. Accounts from across the frontier speak of the way scarcity dominated thought. Men chopped wood with empty stomachs, their strength fading daily. Women rationed meals with agonizing precision, deciding who would eat and how much. Children cried themselves to sleep, their bellies empty. In some cases, neighbors shared what they could, pooling resources to save at least a few families from the brink. In others, pride or distance kept families isolated, leading to quiet tragedies discovered only in spring. The winters of 1856 and 1882-81 left particularly vivid records of hunger. In Nebraska during 1856, settlers reported living for weeks on nothing but parched corn, ground by hand into coarse flour. The hard winter of 1880 to 81 which buried the upper Midwest under snow for months, halted railroads that carried food. In Minnesota, newspapers described towns where citizens boiled seed wheat, originally reserved for spring planting, into gruel to stave off starvation. Others slaughtered livestock intended for breeding, sacrificing future prosperity for present survival. Indigenous peoples of the plains and Great Lakes had long adapted to cycles of scarcity. They dried venison, stored wild rice, and relied on communal hunts. But as buffalo herds collapsed and displacement forced many onto reservations with inadequate rations, native families too faced devastating hunger. Government supplies, when delivered, were often spoiled, meager, or delayed. Hunger became not only a seasonal trial, but a systemic crisis. The vanishing food stores of the frontier also exposed deeper vulnerabilities. The dream of self-sufficiency clashed with the realities of climate, geography, and limited technology. Mills were rare, and grinding grain by hand was slow and exhausting. Transportation was unreliable. A heavy snow could sever entire regions from trade, making local stores the only lifeline. When those stores failed, the consequences were immediate. The cultural memory of hunger left marks that lasted generations. Settlers told stories of scraping the bottom of flour barrels, of meals of boiled leather, of children begging for food that simply did not exist. These stories became cautionary tales, teaching future pioneers the importance of over-preparation. Yet no amount of planning could fully insulate against the unpredictable force of winter. Some winters pushed settlers to the edge of taboos. The Donner Party's ordeal in the Sierra Nevada remains the most infamous, but whispers of similar desperation lingered elsewhere. In remote camps cut off by storms, starvation drove people to consume animals not usually eaten: horses, dogs, or even vermin. Such choices, though rarely spoken of, underscored how fragile the line between survival and collapse could be. Hunger also reshaped communities. Churches and towns organized food-sharing efforts, distributing what little they had to widows, orphans, and the sick. In some areas, native peoples provided food to struggling settlers, offering dried fish, venison, or wild rice in acts of generosity rarely acknowledged in later histories. Cooperation could save lives, but only if there was something left to share. For every family that endured, many others were broken by hunger. County records across the Midwest and Great Plains document deaths attributed to exposure and want, a phrase that concealed the reality of starvation. Graves dug in, frozen ground, marked the price of vanishing food stores, while survivors carried the memory into every future winter. In the mythology of the frontier, settlers are often portrayed as endlessly resourceful, carving abundance from wilderness through grit alone. The truth is harsher. Survival was never guaranteed. Food was not always enough, and when it disappeared, the dream of prosperity dissolved into the gnawing silence of hunger. Winter after winter, the vanishing food stores of the frontier revealed the raw edge of survival. They stripped away illusions and forced settlers to confront the most basic of truths, that no matter how determined, no matter how hopeful, human life depended on what could be eaten, preserved, and endured. On the frontier, hunger was not an abstract fear. It was a force that pressed settlers toward decisions they never imagined making. When food ran out, when blizzards sealed cabins and trails, when neighbors could not spare a handful of flour, starvation transformed thriving settlements into desperate camps. These were the moments when the dream of the West collapsed into its harshest reality: survival at any cost. The best-known tragedy remains the Donner Party. Trapped in the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1846 to 47, delayed by poor planning and a disastrous shortcut through the mountains. The party of more than 80 emigrants became snowbound at Truckee Lake, today's Donner Lake. Early storms buried the passes, stranding the group with dwindling supplies. At first, they slaughtered their livestock. Then they boiled hides and chewed leather for sustenance. But as weeks dragged into months, starvation took its toll. By the time rescue parties reached them in February and March, nearly half were dead. Some survivors admitted to cannibalism, consuming the bodies of those who had perished. Though infamous, the Donner Party was not alone. Their story reveals what happened when starvation became stronger than hope. When a camp crossed the breaking point, lesser-known episodes tell the same story. In 1856, the Martin and Willie Handcart Companies, groups of Mormon pioneers traveling to late in the season, were caught by early snowstorms in Wyoming. With few provisions and only handcarts to carry belongings, they endured unimaginable suffering. Rescue parties from Salt Lake eventually reached them, but not before more than 200 emigrants had died of starvation, frostbite, and exhaustion. Survivors remembered nights of tearing scraps of rawhide from handcarts to chew, their bodies too weak to dig graves for the dead. Starving camps were not limited to famous disasters. Across the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Nebraska, county records describe winters where entire families wasted away in isolated cabins. During the hard winter of 1880 to 81, trains bearing food and coal were immobilized by snowdrifts, leaving towns in the upper Midwest cut off for months. In some communities, citizens ground seed wheat meant for spring planting into flour, destroying their future crops for the sake of survival. Others boiled hay or tree bark into thin broths that provided little more than the illusion of nourishment. Hunger gnawed day and night, and the psychological strain was as devastating as the physical. When starvation set in, social bonds were tested. Families who had arrived with optimism now faced unthinkable choices, whether to share what little they had with neighbors, or whether to hoard it for their own survival. Some accounts describe remarkable generosity, settlers pooling resources to save the weakest. Others describe bitter isolation, where families locked themselves in cabins, unwilling to risk sharing what might mean death for their own children. The line between community and collapse was drawn by hunger. Indigenous peoples also endured the scourge of starving camps, particularly after displacement onto reservations. The Dakota War of 1862, sparked in part by withheld government food rations, highlighted the deadly consequences of hunger. Promised supplies failed to arrive, traders refused credit, and Dakota families starved through harsh winters. Leaders, faced with the cries of the hungry, felt forced into desperate measures. Their struggle underscores how hunger was not only a frontier hardship, but a weapon of policy, and neglected starvation carried deep psychological scars. Diaries from settlers reveal the haunting effects of hunger, the endless obsession with food, the despair of watching children wither, the hollow silence of camps where bodies weakened day by day. Survivors often recall the sound of gnawing wood, leather, bark, anything that might stave off death a little longer. For many, these experiences were never spoken of publicly again, too painful and shameful to recount. The breaking point was different for each camp. For some, it came when livestock were gone and fires burned low, when meals shrank to a handful of boiled kernels. For others, It came when neighbors vanished into snowstorms, seeking help, never to return. And for the most desperate, the breaking point came when human bodies became the last source of sustenance. Though rare, such acts became the most haunting legacy of starving camps, marking how far the frontier could strip away the veneer of civilization. Yet within this darkness, there were also stories of endurance. Rescue parties, often risking their own lives, struggled through blizzards to bring relief. In Wyoming, Mormon rescuers carried food on their backs through waist-deep snow to reach stranded handcart pioneers. In the Dakota Territory, communities rallied to distribute what little remained to keep families alive until spring. These acts of courage remind us that even in starving camps, solidarity could endure alongside desperation. Starving camps revealed the frontier's deepest truth. Survival was fragile, and no amount of planning guaranteed safety. A single miscalculation, leaving too late, bringing too little, or trusting to luck, could tip entire groups into catastrophe. Hunger did not discriminate. It struck emigrants chasing gold, religious refugees, immigrant farmers, and indigenous nations alike. The legacy of these camps is sobering. They remind us that the westward expansion was not only a story of opportunity, but of profound suffering. Behind every fertile homestead lay the memory of families who never survived their first winter, their names lost to snow and silence. The breaking point was not simply a test of endurance. It was the moment when hunger stripped away hope, when survival demanded impossible choices, and when the dream of the frontier dissolved into the most primal struggle of all. For pioneers battling cold and hunger, the wilderness itself was never silent. Beyond the walls of cabins and the glow of campfires, predators moved through the snow. Among them, none captured the imagination and fear of settlers more than wolves. To those who had crossed oceans and prairies in search of land, the howls that echoed across the night were chilling reminders that they were not alone. Wolves became symbols of the wilderness, relentless, cunning, and ever-present at the edge of survival. In the northern forests of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, wolves roamed in large numbers throughout the 19th century. They thrived in conditions that punished settlers, hunting deer, elk, and smaller prey with efficiency honed over centuries. For families unaccustomed to predators of this scale, their presence was alarming. Letters and diaries often described the terror of hearing wolf packs circling a homestead at night, their cries blending with the wind. One Wisconsin settler in the 1840s recorded that wolves gathered so close to his cabin that their eyes gleamed in the firelight through cracks in the walls. The fear of wolves was not without cause. Starvation often drove packs closer to settlements, particularly during harsh winters when natural prey grew scarce. Livestock became easy targets. Chickens, pigs, sheep, and even calves vanished in the night, leaving settlers to find bloodied snow and scattered bones. For families whose survival depended on a few animals, each loss was devastating. In many communities, wolf hunts became routine. Neighbors gathered to track and kill predators before they claimed more. Counties across the Midwest offered bounties for wolf scalps, an official recognition of how dangerous they were to fragile frontier economies. The dangers of wolves were magnified in starving camps. When livestock weakened from hunger or froze in blizzards, carcasses drew predators from miles away. The Donner Party survivors recalled wolves prowling near their snowbound camp, scavenging dead oxen and circling the cabins at night. In other accounts, settlers described the eerie silence when wolves ceased howling, often a sign they were closing in. The psychological strain of living with predators just beyond the firelight added another layer to already overwhelming hardship. Indigenous peoples had long coexisted with wolves, respecting them as hunters and, in some traditions, as spiritual kin. For the Lakota, Dakota, and Ojibwe, wolves were teachers of endurance and strategy. They were not merely threats, but figures of cultural significance. Settlers, however, saw them almost exclusively as enemies. This clash of perspectives revealed deeper differences in how the land and its creatures were understood. Where native traditions emphasized balance, settlers sought domination. Seeing wolf eradication as part of taming the frontier, the battles between settlers and wolves grew intense during the 1860s and 1870s as farming expanded into the Great Plains. Open ranges made livestock easy prey, and winter shortages drove wolves into corrals and barns. Accounts from Kansas and Nebraska tell of families waking to find dozens of sheep slaughtered in a single night. These raids devastated communities already strained by cold and hunger. Wolf drives, large, organized hunts, were organized to cull entire packs. Yet, despite efforts, wolves proved resilient, adapting and returning year after year. Beyond the material threat, wolves carried symbolic weight. For many settlers, they represented the untamed wild pressing against fragile human settlements. The glow of a fire at night became a small island of safety, its circle of light holding back not only darkness, but the possibility of predators waiting beyond. Children were warned never to stray from the fire's edge. Women gathering water or men hauling wood after dark risked encounters that could prove fatal. Though verified attacks on humans were rare, the fear was constant, magnified by the eerie chorus of howls that rolled across frozen landscapes. The tension between settlers and wolves reached its peak during extreme winters. In the Dakota Territory in 1881, newspapers reported wolves entering towns to scavenge from refuse heaps, their desperation blurring the line between wilderness and settlement. Farmers described wolves so emboldened by hunger that they stalked sleighs on frozen roads, darting in to snatch weakened horses. These accounts, while sometimes exaggerated, underscored the vulnerability settlers felt when nature pressed hardest. Efforts to protect livestock often consumed precious resources. Building stronger barns, standing guard at night, or organizing hunts required time and energy that settlers could scarcely spare. Ammunition was not always abundant, and many wasted valuable powder on shots that missed. Traps and poison were employed, but these too required materials and knowledge. In many cases, settlers resigned themselves to losses, recognizing that wolves were as much a part of the frontier as the storms and hunger they faced. The war against wolves was ultimately successful in its own brutal terms. By the late 19th century, relentless hunting, bounties, and habitat destruction drove wolf populations into steep decline across much of the Midwest and plains. For settlers, this represented victory, a sign that the wilderness was being tamed. Yet the disappearance of wolves also marked the end of an ancient balance. Deer populations exploded without their natural predators, and ecological systems shifted in ways settlers did not foresee. For those who lived through the era, however, the memory of wolves lingered. Stories of glowing eyes in the dark, of howls carried on winter winds, became part of frontier folklore. They symbolized the thin boundary between safety and peril, between the warmth of a fire and the hunger of the wilderness. Wolves at the edge of the firelight were more than animals. They were a reminder that the frontier was never fully conquered, that survival required vigilance, and that danger always pressed just beyond the reach of human hands. In the collective memory of pioneer life, wolves came to embody the fear of being surrounded by cold, by hunger, by forces beyond control. They were not the greatest threats settlers faced, but their presence in the night reminded every family huddled by a fire that the wilderness was watching, waiting and enduring just as they were. Winter on the frontier was not only a battle against hunger and cold, but against the human body itself. The elements attacked flesh and bone in ways settlers had never imagined, leaving scars that lasted a lifetime or ending lives outright. Frostbite, hypothermia, and sickness spread through cabins and camps, claiming victims quietly but relentlessly. For many families, disease struck harder than wolves or blizzards. It was the unseen enemy that thrived in the freezing dark. Frostbite was one of the most visible afflictions. Settlers trudging through snow to chop wood, fetch water, or tend livestock often returned with fingers, toes, or noses blackened by the cold. Diaries from Minnesota in the 1850s describe farmers whose hands stiffened so badly they could no longer hold an axe, forcing their children to take up the work. In Dakota Territory, during the 188081 hard winter, stories circulated of men frozen stiff only yards from their cabins, their faces unrecognizable beneath sheets of ice. Survival often meant mutilation, amputations performed with crude tools, no anesthesia, and little understanding of infection. Losing digits or limbs was common. The price of firewood or food could be a hand or foot left in the snow. Hypothermia claimed lives even within shelters. Sod houses and log cabins, though better than tents, could not always keep out the cold. Temperatures in the northern plains regularly plunged to 30 or 40 below zero. Fires burned down overnight, and families awoke to find infants frozen in their beds. Exhaustion made matters worse. Men too tired to keep watch over fires, women too drained to tend flames, sometimes surrendered for a few hours of rest, hours that ended in tragedy. In many communities, neighbors discovered bodies in the spring. Entire families huddled together in frozen stillness. Illness thrived in these conditions. Poor sanitation, cramped quarters, and smoke-filled shelters weakened immune systems. Pneumonia and bronchitis swept through cabins, claiming the young and old. Influenza outbreaks were common, spreading rapidly through wagon trains in towns where settlers huddled together for warmth. Without medicine, the sick were left to sweat beneath blankets or choke in the smoke of poorly ventilated fires. Mortality was high, and survivors carried lasting weakness into the next year. One of the deadliest diseases of the frontier was cholera, though it struck more often on trails than in deep winter. Between 1849 and 1855, tens of thousands of emigrants died as cholera swept along the Oregon and California trails. Contaminated water and poor hygiene fueled the epidemic. Families who had survived hunger and cold were undone in days by vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration. Though less common in snowbound cabins, its shadow hung over every journey. Typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox also ravaged frontier settlements. Starving families often resorted to drinking melted snow or contaminated streams, spreading illness faster. Children weakened by malnutrition were easy prey. In the winter of 1862, Minnesota settlers recorded outbreaks of diphtheria that left graveyards filled with small coffins. Newspapers carried notices of entire families wiped out within weeks. Medical care on the frontier was rudimentary at best. Physicians were scarce, and many settlers relied on home remedies passed down through generations. Whiskey, vinegar, poultices of herbs, or bloodletting were common treatments, often doing more harm than good. Amputations were done with sores heated in fires, sometimes cauterized with hot irons. Infection followed almost inevitably. Antibiotics were still decades away, and antiseptic practices were not widely accepted until the late 19th century. For many, the choice was grim: endure pain and risk infection, or die untreated. Indigenous communities faced similar struggles, compounded by displacement and lack of resources. Traditional remedies from willow bark to sweat lodges provided some relief, but the arrival of settlers brought new diseases for which native peoples had no immunity. Smallpox epidemics devastated tribes across the Great Plains and Great Lakes, wiping out entire villages in the 1830s and 1850s. Winter, when bodies were weakest and food scarce, became the season of highest mortality. The psychological toll of frostbite and fever was immense. Survivors often spoke of shame and despair at their disfigurements. Men unable to work after losing limbs faced poverty. Women, weakened by illness, struggled to care for children. Families carried trauma not only from death, but from the slow, lingering decline of loved ones in the depths of winter. Communities measured time by epidemics: the winter of diphtheria, the year of the hard cough, the season of fever. Yet resilience grew from suffering. Some settlers developed networks of care, with neighbors tending to the sick or sharing scarce remedies. Churches often served as makeshift hospitals, where families pooled resources to comfort the dying. In towns large enough to support doctors, medical societies began to form, exchanging knowledge and spreading practices like vaccination. Slowly, across decades, frontier medicine adapted, but in the early years, most relied on endurance, prayer, and the slim hope that spring would arrive before illness claimed another victim. Frostbite and fever stripped away illusions of control. They revealed how fragile the human body was against nature's extremes. Settlers could chop wood, build cabins, and plant fields, but they could not stop infection from spreading through a single crowded room. They could not always keep the fire burning through the night. The frontier was not only a place of external danger, but of internal betrayal, where the body itself became the battlefield. The legacy of frostbite and fever endured long after winters passed. Survivors carried missing limbs, weakened lungs, or chronic coughs into old age. Communities remembered the winters when half their children died, shaping cultural memory and caution. For indigenous peoples, epidemics left generational scars, reducing populations and disrupting traditions. These memories shaped the way settlers and native peoples alike viewed the land not as a place of easy opportunity, but as a landscape that demanded sacrifice in flesh and blood. Winter on the frontier was merciless. It tested not only the ability to endure cold and hunger, but the resilience of bodies racked by frost and fever. Every scar, every grave, was a reminder that survival was not guaranteed, and that the line between life and death was often no wider than the glow of a fire or the thickness of a blanket. Asterisk. On the frontier, children bore the same winters as their parents, yet their smaller bodies and fragile health made them the most vulnerable. The cold carved childhoods into shapes of hardship, where survival itself became a lesson learned too early. Diaries, letters, and community records reveal how deeply the winters scarred young lives, and how, against all odds, some children became symbols of resilience. Infant mortality was already high in 19th century America. On the frontier, it was higher still. Poor sanitation, lack of medical care, and malnutrition left newborns perilously weak. Winter compounded these risks. Infants born in December or January often faced freezing cabins, fires too small to warm them, and mothers exhausted by childbirth with little food or help. Families described wrapping newborns in animal hides or quilts sewn from scraps, hoping to keep them alive through nights when temperatures fell below zero. Many did not survive. County cemeteries across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas filled with tiny graves, silent testimony to the brutal cost of winter. Older children, though sturdier, faced their own trials. Boys as young as 6 were expected to haul wood, fetch water from frozen creeks, and help care for livestock. Girls tended fires, cooked meals, and sewed clothing by firelight. Frostbite was common. In one 1861 account from Iowa, a 9-year-old boy lost 3 toes after carrying water barefoot through deep snow when his boots wore through. Such injuries often left children disabled for life, shaping their futures long after the winter had passed. Hunger struck children hardest. Malnutrition stunted growth and weakened immune systems, leaving them easy prey for disease. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, and measles swept through cabins during the winter months, often killing the young while sparing the old. In Minnesota in the 1870s, entire families lost half their children in a single season. Survivors carried lifelong grief, parents who never spoke of the children they buried, siblings who grew up in the shadow of loss. Yet children were not only victims. Their labor was vital to family survival. Boys trapped rabbits or birds to supplement meager diets. Girls helped churn butter, grind grain, or tend sick relatives. Their contributions were often the difference between endurance and collapse. In many communities, children's resilience amazed their elders. Letters describe 80-year-olds walking miles through snow to fetch help for sick parents, or tending fires through the night while adults searched for food. Education suffered in winter. Schools closed when snow made travel impossible, and many children lost entire seasons of learning. In isolated areas, schooling was abandoned altogether during harsh winters, replaced by chores and survival tasks. Yet in towns large enough to support schools, winter sometimes became the only season of instruction, as farming eased and children were free from fields. Teachers bundled children in blankets and held lessons by stoves, their ink freezing on desks when fuel ran low. Play still found a place, though shaped by the cold. Children skated on frozen ponds, built sleds from barrel staves, and made toys from scraps of wood. Laughter, even in starving camps, pierced the silence of snow. But games were often cut short by exhaustion or hunger, and many remembered their childhoods less for play than for survival. The role of children extended into the cultural memory of the frontier. Stories of their endurance became part of local lore, celebrated as evidence of pioneer toughness. Newspapers printed tales of boys surviving blizzards alone, or girls rescuing siblings from burning cabins. These stories, while extraordinary, also masked the quieter reality. Thousands of children did not survive, and their names disappeared from official records. Indigenous children endured parallel struggles, intensified by displacement and disease. Winters on reservations were marked by hunger, poor rations, and epidemics. Boarding schools, imposed in later decades, stripped children from their families, compounding trauma. Yet oral histories recall indigenous children's resilience, helping gather wood, caring for elders, and maintaining traditions even in the face of scarcity. Their endurance mirrored that of settler children, though shaped by very different cultural contexts. The memory of children lost to winter's haunted families for generations. In letters home to Europe, immigrants often warned relatives of the dangers, recounting how many children perished their first years. Some begged others not to come. For those who remained, grief became a silent presence. Parents rarely spoke of lost children, but they carried the pain into every spring planting and every winter night by the fire. Despite the suffering, children also embodied hope. Each child who survived became proof that families could endure, that settlements could grow, and that futures could be built from frozen hardship. Communities often rallied to protect orphans, adopting them into households or sharing food when parents died. These acts of care reinforced social bonds, ensuring that even in loss, children remained central to survival. The frontier shaped children in ways few could imagine. They learned early that life was precarious, that hunger and cold were constant threats, and that survival required sacrifice. Many grew into adults who carried scars, physical from frostbite, emotional from loss, but also a resilience that defined frontier identity. They became the generation who built schools, churches, and towns. Their childhoods forged in the crucible of winter. Children of the cold remind us that the frontier was never simply a story of adults carving land from wilderness. It was also a story of the youngest, whose small hands gathered wood, whose laughter briefly warmed cabins, and whose graves dotted the frozen landscapes of a nation in the making. For settlers, the frontier's winters tested not only the body but also the mind. Hunger and frostbite were visible wounds. Isolation, despair, and psychological collapse were invisible ones. The long months of snow and silence, broken only by the cry of wolves or the crack of ice on rivers, weighed heavily on those who had come west with dreams of freedom and abundance. The mental strain of survival in such conditions was often as deadly as the physical. Isolation was perhaps the greatest burden. Many families lived miles from their nearest neighbors. When snowstorms blocked trails, cabins became prisons. Days blended into weeks, and weeks into months. Journals describe the eerie stillness, the muffled world outside, where no footsteps could be heard, and the cabin interiors where conversation dwindled to silence. Loneliness grew sharper with each passing day. A Minnesota settler in the 1850s wrote that the walls pressed in upon us, and the snow buried us as surely as a grave. For women, isolation was particularly severe. While men sometimes hunted, cut wood, or traveled for supplies, women remained in cabins, caring for children and tending fires without reprieve. Letters reveal exhaustion, depression, and the crushing monotony of endless days indoors. With no community support, many mothers carried the weight of grief when children died during winter. In some accounts, widowed women perished not from hunger, but from despair, unwilling to continue alone. Men, too, were not immune. Farmers and laborers, raised on the expectation of productivity, struggled when trapped indoors for months. The inability to plant, build, or provide left many feeling useless. Some turned to alcohol, if available, as both escape and poison. Frontier newspapers occasionally reported suicides during winter months, men who walked into snowstorms and never returned, their bodies found only in spring. The mental toll extended to children, confined to cabins, Deprived of play and schooling, they absorbed their parents' despair. Accounts describe children who became withdrawn, listless, or ill with no apparent cause beyond the crushing environment. The lack of stimulation and the constant awareness of hunger shaped childhoods into seasons of silence and fear. Religious faith provided one of the few psychological anchors. Families prayed together, read scripture, or sang hymns by firelight. For some, faith transformed despair into endurance. Yet others found their beliefs shaken. When children died, or when starvation consumed entire communities, questions of divine justice haunted survivors. Ministers and missionaries wrote of dwindling congregations during harsh winters. As hope itself seemed buried in snow, community bonds, when possible, offered relief. In settlements large enough to maintain churches, schools, or gathering halls, winter events helped stave off despair. Quilting circles, barn dances, and religious meetings gave settlers reasons to leave their cabins and see neighbors. But for isolated families, such lifelines were absent. Their winters were measured by the sound of the wind through cracks in the cabin wall. Indigenous peoples also faced psychological strain during winters, though their traditions often provided different frameworks for resilience. Stories, songs, and communal ceremonies helped maintain morale through the dark months. Yet forced relocation to reservations, the loss of traditional food sources, and epidemics eroded these supports. Oral histories describe despair spreading as hunger and disease struck communities already reeling from displacement. In both native and settler camps, the cold reached not only the body but the spirit. The toll of frontier winters often lingered long after snow melted. Survivors carried trauma that shaped their lives. Diaries from widows recount recurring nightmares of blizzards and starvation. Men who had lost entire families often moved east, unable to endure the reminders. Children grew into adults who spoke little of their winters, but who raised their own children with obsessive caution, hoarding food, fearing hunger, and never forgetting the silence of isolation. Medical understanding of mental illness was limited in the 19th century. Terms like melancholia or nervous exhaustion appear in records, but depression and trauma were rarely recognized as conditions in need of treatment. Communities viewed such suffering as weakness or moral failure. As a result, many endured in silence, their struggles hidden behind stoicism. Despite the darkness, there were stories of remarkable resilience. Families created rituals to fight monotony, reading aloud, teaching letters to children, carving toys, or telling stories that preserved culture and hope. These small acts helped some maintain balance. They illustrate how, even in starving camps and snowbound cabins, the human mind sought meaning and connection. The silent toll of winter remains one of the least visible aspects of frontier life, overshadowed by tales of physical endurance. Yet it was as real as hunger and frostbite. It shaped communities, scarred survivors, and revealed the fragility of human spirit when cut off from connection. For every story of grit and determination, there were others of despair and collapse. Buried in the snows of memory, winter on the frontier was a crucible, not only of the body, but of the mind. It tested the boundaries of endurance, revealing how isolation, grief, and silence could erode even the strongest will. The settlers who endured were not unbreakable. They were scarred, carrying invisible wounds that lasted long after the snows had melted. On the frontier, where winters claimed lives with cold, hunger, and sickness, survival was not built on strength alone. Settlers needed more than food and fire to endure. They needed something to keep despair at bay, belief that tomorrow was worth reaching. Faith, folklore, and hope became tools as vital as axes and rifles. In cabins half buried by snow, in camps where rations had dwindled to scraps, the human spirit clung to stories, rituals, and convictions that gave meaning to suffering. Religion stood at the center of frontier life. Most settlers carried Bibles alongside their few possessions, and scripture was often the first book opened when snow-sealed cabins shut. Families gathered around firelight to read aloud, reciting verses that promised deliverance or endurance. Psalms of suffering, passages of faith tested in deserts or floods, became mirrors of their own trials. For many, belief in divine purpose transformed winter from a random punishment into a test of spirit. Surviving hunger and frost was not only endurance, it was perseverance under God's watch. Churches, when they existed, were lifelines. In settlements large enough to gather, religious services broke the monotony of winter. Hymns filled halls where silence otherwise reigned, their words echoing across snowbound towns. Ministers preached not only salvation but resilience, urging families to hold fast until spring. In diaries from Iowa and Wisconsin, settlers described Sunday services as the only warmth beyond the fire, where shared faith united isolated families into something stronger. Yet faith also carried strain. When children died despite prayer, when hunger claimed the righteous alongside the careless, some settlers felt their convictions weaken. Ministers lamented dwindling attendance in winters of famine, writing of flocks whose faith had frozen with the ground. Survivors sometimes spoke of crises of belief, moments when divine providence felt absent in the silence of snow. For some, winters broke not only bodies, but trust in heaven itself. Folklore filled the spaces faith could not. Settlers carried with them stories from Europe, tales of harsh winters, spirits of the cold, and warnings about straying too far from hearths at night. Germans spoke of the urgest spirits of earth and forest, while Scandinavians remembered tales of trolls and frost giants. Around fires, these stories became entertainment for children and reminders of old worlds left behind. They gave shape to fear, turning the endless night into something that could be named and told. New folklore emerged in America itself. Wolves circling cabins became figures of myth, symbols of the wilderness waiting beyond the firelight. Tales spread of neighbors lost in blizzards, only to wander as ghostly figures across the snow. The silence of the prairie gave rise to legends of voices in the wind, interpreted as omens or warnings. These stories, though frightening, provided a framework for the unknown, allowing families to transform raw fear into narratives they could share. Indigenous traditions offered different sources of hope. Lakota, Dakota, and Ojibwe communities told winter stories as part of cultural teaching, passing on history and lessons through oral tradition. These tales carried moral guidance, strategies for survival, and reminders of resilience. Storytelling was not mere diversion, it was a cultural anchor in times of scarcity. Even as displacement and famine struck native communities, these traditions preserved identity and meaning. For settlers who interacted with indigenous peoples, glimpses of this resilience sometimes left impressions. Though rarely acknowledged in written accounts, music was another thread of endurance. Fiddles, harmonicas, and simple flutes filled cabins with sound, turning despair into brief celebration. Songs carried from Ireland, Scotland, or Scandinavia blended with American hymns, becoming part of frontier culture. Families sang not only for joy but for survival, lifting spirits when food was gone and snow showed no end. A song by firelight could remind listeners that they were still human, not just survivors in a wilderness. Hope was also found in ritual. The act of planting seed wheat in spring, even after starving through winter, symbolized belief in tomorrow. Lighting candles on Christmas, baking bread for New Year's, or marking birthdays with simple gestures carried enormous weight. These traditions connected families to continuity, reminding them that hardship was a season, not an eternity. In many letters, settlers described the power of such rituals. A holiday meal shared from the last flower, a hymn sung as snow-battered walls, as lifelines of morale. Yet hope was fragile. Starving camps often recorded the moment when it broke. Diaries shift from words of endurance to silence, pages left blank as despair consumed writers. When faith, folklore, and rituals no longer sustained families, survival became mechanical, stripped of meaning. These were the darkest winters, when belief itself froze alongside bodies still. Enough families found strength in hope to endure. Survivors remembered prayers said over empty tables, songs sung over graves, stories told to children too hungry to sleep. They testified that without these intangible defenses, the frontier would have claimed far more lives. Faith, folklore, and hope did not provide food or fire, but they gave settlers reason to fight for both. In the collective memory of pioneer life, these unseen weapons of survival are often overshadowed by axes, rifles, and wagons. Yet they were as essential as any tool. They reveal the truth that endurance is not only physical but spiritual, that the frontier demanded resilience of the heart as well as the hand. Without faith, without stories, without hope, the silence of winter might have swallowed entire communities. Death was a constant companion on the frontier, but in winter it carried a particularly cruel weight. Cold did not only claim lives, it dictated how the dead were remembered, mourned, and laid to rest. In frozen ground where shovels struck ice, in snowdrifts that swallowed cabins, settlers confronted the harsh reality that even burial was a struggle. The dead of winter often remained above ground, their presence haunting survivors until spring thawed the earth. Graves could not always be dug in frozen soil. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, settlers wrote of hacking at iron-hard ground with axes and crowbars, often managing only shallow pits. Bodies were covered with snow, stones, or logs to keep scavenging animals away until proper burial could be made in spring. Families left crude markers, wooden crosses, piles of brush, or carved initials in tree bark, temporary memorials for those claimed by cold. In many cases, the graves vanished by thaw, erased by floods or wolves, leaving no permanent trace. The emotional toll was immense. Families forced to live alongside the dead through winter often described the experience in hushed tones. In Dakota Territory in the 1870s, one settler recalled keeping his wife's body in a shed for months until the earth softened. Others wrapped loved ones in blankets and placed them in shallow snowbanks, praying scavengers would not disturb them. Such practices were not choices of neglect, but of necessity. Winter denied the dignity of proper burials. Starving camps faced even harsher realities. The Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada in 1846 to 47, left records of bodies buried in shallow snow, only to be exposed by storms and scavenged by animals. Some were never buried at all, their deaths recorded in diaries, but their remains lost to in the Mormon handcart tragedies of 1856. Survivors later testified of digging graves in frozen earth with bare hands, laying multiple bodies together when strength and time ran out. The sight of small graves filled with children left scars that survivors carried for life. Communal cemeteries grew slowly on the frontier. In towns large enough to sustain them, churches often oversaw burial grounds. But for isolated families, burial was solitary. A child might be interred on a hillside, a husband beneath a grove of trees, a wife in a corner of farmland. These graves became part of the land itself, reminders of loss and anchors of memory. Many pioneers later described staying on land not for prosperity, but because family dead rested there, binding them to place. For indigenous peoples, winter burials carried spiritual as well as practical significance. Ojibwe and Dakota traditions included rituals to guide spirits to the next world, but frozen conditions often forced adaptation. Oral histories describe bodies left in elevated platforms or wrapped in hides until spring allowed proper ceremonies. The disruption of these traditions by displacement and starvation added another layer of grief. Compounding loss with cultural rupture, religious conviction shaped burial practices. Settlers often read scripture over graves, even if the ground was shallow or temporary. Psalms of mourning or prayers for eternal rest echoed across snowy landscapes. For families cut off from clergy, the role of minister fell to fathers or mothers, who recited words of comfort even as despair consumed them. Faith provided dignity where circumstance denied it. Yet not all dead received rites. In starving camps, where survival consumed all strength, bodies were sometimes left where they fell. Survivors described the numbing effect of constant death. Grief dulled by exhaustion, mourning postponed by hunger. In such moments, the dead became both a reminder of fragility and, in extreme cases, a source of sustenance. The line between burial and survival blurred, marking some of the darkest chapters of frontier history. Spring brought both relief and renewed grief. When ground thawed, families who had stored or covered bodies could finally lay them to rest. Communities gathered for delayed funerals, turning private tragedies into shared mourning. But thaw also revealed what winter had concealed: cabins filled with frozen bodies, shallow snow graves scattered with bones, entire families lost to storms. The dead buried in snow returned in spring, forcing survivors to confront the full weight of loss. The memory of winter deaths lingered in stories and local histories. Communities spoke of the winter we buried half our town, or the year the ground would not open. These phrases became markers of time, defining seasons not by harvests but by mortality. For settlers, death in winter was not exceptional, it was expected. The true measure was how families endured despite it. For those who survived, the graves in snow-shaped identity. They reminded settlers that survival came at the cost of neighbors, children, and spouses. They reinforced the fragility of life and the importance of preparation. And they bound communities together, each grave a shared scar of hardship. The frontier is often remembered as a place of beginnings, but winter made it equally a place of endings. The dead buried in snow tell the unvarnished truth that expansion carried with it not only dreams but endless loss, etched into frozen landscapes and carried silently in memory. Among the darkest shadows cast by frontier winters are the stories whispered, more than spoken, tales of hunger so deep, desperation so absolute that human flesh became the last resource. These are the echoes of cannibal camps, moments when starvation drove emigrants beyond the boundaries of cultural taboo. Though rare, they left marks on the historical memory of westward expansion, haunting survivors and reshaping the mythology of the frontier. The most infamous case remains the Donner Party. In 1846, nearly 90 emigrants set out for California. Following poor advice, they attempted a new route through the Sierra Nevada, known as the Hastings Cutoff. Delays plagued their journey, and by late October, heavy snow sealed the mountain passes. Trapped near Truckee Lake, now Donner Lake, they constructed crude cabins and attempted to endure the winter. Food supplies dwindled rapidly. Livestock died, hides were boiled into soup, and leather was chewed to stave off hunger. By December, with no rescue in sight, members of the camp made the fateful decision to consume the dead. Survivors' accounts are chilling. George Donner's wife, Tamsin, refused to eat human flesh, even as she weakened fatally. Children, spared by adults, nonetheless witnessed the desperation around them. When rescue parties finally reached the survivors in February and March of 1847, they found scenes of horror, cabins littered with bones, bodies partly consumed. Out of 87 emigrants, only 48 survived. The Donner Party became a byword for the nightmare of migration, remembered less for their journey than for the cannibalism forced upon them. But the Donner tragedy was not unique. Just a decade later, in 1856, Mormon pioneers of the Willie and Martin Handcart companies faced starvation in Wyoming. Trapped by early snowstorms, weakened by weeks of insufficient rations, some survivors later admitted that rumors of cannibalism circulated among the dying. While historians debate the veracity, what is certain is that hundreds perished from starvation, frostbite, and exhaustion. The line between survival and collapse was thin, and whispers of cannibalism reflected how close the camps came to the campus. The frontier itself bore witness to similar ordeals in less recorded places. In 1873, near present-day Montana, reports surfaced of a small group of prospectors trapped in the mountains during winter. When spring came, rescuers discovered evidence suggesting cannibalism, though details were quickly hushed in newspapers. Fear of social stigma often erased such accounts, leaving only fragments in court records or oral histories. Families rarely spoke of them, and survivors carried the secret to their graves. Cannibalism in starving camps was not a choice, but an act of last resort. Survivors consistently described revulsion, shame, and despair. They emphasized that flesh was taken only from those already dead, never by murder. In the Donner accounts, survivors recalled praying before consuming human remains, pleading forgiveness. These narratives reveal how deeply the act conflicted with cultural and religious beliefs. Yet hunger's power was absolute. The instinct to survive overwhelmed taboo, even as it scarred survivors for life. The psychological aftermath was immense. Donner survivors lived with stigma long after rescue. Newspapers sensationalized their ordeal, branding them as symbols of savagery or folly. Some survivors avoided speaking of it altogether, refusing interviews or retreating into silence. Children who lived through the camp grew into adulthood, marked by whispers, their reputations tainted by events they could not control. Cannibalism became both a survival strategy and a lifelong burden. Indigenous peoples, too, recorded instances of starvation so severe that cannibalism occurred, particularly during winters when bison herds collapsed or government rations failed. Oral traditions sometimes framed these acts as cautionary tales, moral lessons about greed, poor leadership, or broken balance with the natural world. In both native and settler contexts, cannibalism represented the breaking point of community and humanity, invoked in memory as the ultimate symbol of desperation. The echoes of cannibal camps also shaped popular imagination. Writers, journalists, and historians used them to illustrate the dangers of the frontier. Sensational accounts filled newspapers in the mid-19th century, feeding public fascination with horror at the edges of civilization. The Donner Party, in particular, became both a cautionary tale about poor planning and a dark legend retold in literature, theatre, and even school lessons. But the sensationalism often obscured the human reality. Ordinary families trapped in extraordinary conditions, forced into choices no one wished to make. For settlers who read these stories, cannibalism served as both warning and motivator. It emphasized the importance of preparation, timing, and community cooperation. Families setting out on trails carried more food, built stronger wagons, and heeded advice to avoid late departures. Fear of becoming another Donner Party shaped migration decisions for decades. The legacy of cannibal camps was not only horror but practical caution etched into collective memory. Despite the weight of stigma, these stories endure because they reveal the raw edge of survival. They strip away myths of manifest destiny and pioneer triumph, exposing the human cost of expansion. They remind us that the frontier was not only a place of opportunity, but of limits of endurance, of morality, and of hope. The cannibal camps stand as dark mirrors to the optimism of migration, proof that beneath dreams of abundance lay the possibility of unthinkable desperation. The echoes remain unsettling because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Faced with starvation, the body demands survival at any cost. The frontier exposed that reality without mercy. Those who endured carried scars deeper than frostbite or hunger. They carried the memory of choices that defied every cultural boundary, whispered only in the darkest hours of winter. For frontier families, spring was both salvation and new trial. After months of silence, snow, and hunger, the thaw arrived as a lifeline. Rivers began to flow again, trails reopened, and frozen earth softened enough to plant crops and bury the dead. Yet the thaw carried destruction as well as renewal. The melting snow revealed losses too great to ignore and unleashed dangers that brought fresh waves of suffering. Survival through winter was not the end. It was only the beginning of another struggle. The first sign of spring was often water. Streams, once sealed by ice, cracked open, flooding valleys and washing away cabins and fences. In lowland settlements of Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, thawing snows turned prairies into seas of mud. Wagons sank axle-deep, livestock floundered, and entire communities found themselves cut off, not by snow but by floodwaters. Diaries from 1850s Iowa describe families climbing to rooftops as swollen rivers swept barns and fields away, undoing months of labor. The thaw that freed them from cold often destroyed their foundations. For many, thaw also meant exposure. Cabins buried in snowdrifts emerged to reveal roofs collapsed, walls warped, and livestock frozen in barns. When snow melted, settlers discovered neighbors who had perished unseen. County records from Minnesota in the 1870s document the grim discoveries of families found in cabins, their bodies preserved in ice. Spring thaw forced survivors to confront the full toll of winter, turning landscapes into open graves. Food supplies, already scarce, faced new threats in thaw. Meltwater seeped into root cellars, rotting what little potatoes or turnips remained. Grain stored in damp barns sprouted or molded. Meat once frozen safely outside spoiled quickly, filling cabins with stench. Families who had rationed carefully now found their reserves useless, leaving them to endure hunger just as planting season demanded strength. The thaw, far from immediate relief, often prolonged famine into spring. Disease thrived in these conditions. Melting snow mixed with human and animal waste, contaminating wells and streams. Typhoid and dysentery spread quickly, carried by polluted water. In Nebraska, during the 1881 floods that followed the hard winter, outbreaks of disease struck weakened populations, killing those who had survived the cold. Children, already malnourished, succumbed in large numbers. Doctors, where present, had little to offer beyond quarantine and rudimentary remedies. The thaw brought warmth, but it also carried sickness in its waters for indigenous peoples. Spring marked seasonal migrations and renewed hunting. Yet displacement and confinement on reservations disrupted these patterns. Loss of bison herds meant that the thaw no longer guaranteed food. Government rations, often spoiled or delayed, arrived too late to prevent suffering. Oral histories describe communities emerging from winter only to find hunger extended into spring, as traditional resources were gone. For them, thaw brought little relief, only a new season of struggle. Yet amid destruction, the thaw carried undeniable hope. Survivors wrote of the joy of hearing rivers run again, of children playing in mud instead of shivering in cabins, of sunlight returning after months of gloom. Planting became a ritual of renewal. Seed grain, pressed into thawed soil, symbolized both sustenance and belief in the future. Families who had buried children during winter spoke of finding strength in the act of planting, a commitment to continue despite grief. Communities also re-emerged with thaw. Neighbors who had been snowbound for months visited one another, sharing news of survival and mourning losses together. Churches held delayed funerals, cemeteries filled with burials postponed by frozen ground. These gatherings transformed isolation into solidarity, turning individual endurance into collective resilience. The thaw revealed tragedy, but it also revived community bonds. Economically, spring was decisive. Survivors had to rebuild quickly to secure harvests. Flooded fields needed draining, livestock herds replenished, and cabins repaired. Those who had slaughtered breeding animals during winter faced years of recovery. In some cases, families abandoned claims altogether, unable to recover from losses. Letters from the Dakotas in the 1880s describe families selling land for pennies after winters and thaws erased their means of survival. Others, however, dug in with renewed determination, their resolve hardened by suffering. The thaw also carried symbolic weight. Writers of the time often described it as a resurrection, a metaphor for endurance rewarded. Yet this romantic view masked the harsh realities. Floods, disease, and famine often struck hardest after thaw. For many, the season was not a deliverance, but a cruel reminder that the frontier offered no easy salvation. Survival required enduring both the silence of winter and the chaos of spring. By the late 19th century, railroads began to alter this cycle. Towns connected by rail could receive food, coal, and medicine earlier in spring, lessening the hardships of thaw. Yet for isolated settlements, the pattern endured. Relief mingled with destruction, hope tempered by grief. The thaw remained a moment of reckoning, a season that tested whether families could rebuild from what winter had taken. The frontier's mythology often celebrates survival through winter, but the thaw tells a fuller story. It was the moment when losses became visible, when the dead were buried, when famine either ended or deepened, and when communities decided whether to endure or abandon. It was both salvation and devastation. A season that revealed survival was never final, but always provisional. For settlers, the thaw etched memory as deeply as winter itself. They remembered not only the snow that trapped them, but the floods that followed. The graves revealed, the sickness spread, and the fields replanted in defiance. The thaw was proof that the frontier never gave without taking. It saved and it destroyed. And in its duality, it defined the cycle of survival on the edge of a continent. The winters of the frontier did not vanish with the melting snow. Their memory lingered in scars, in stories, in the very fabric of communities that endured them. For settlers and indigenous peoples alike, the legacy of ice and hunger shaped identities, economies, and cultural memory for generations. These were not simply seasons of hardship. They became defining elements of the frontier's history, etched into lives and landscapes. Families who survived harsh winters often carried habits born of fear. Diaries and oral histories describe settlers who hoarded food long after conditions improved, filling cellars with more than they could ever consume. Some buried grain in hidden pits, fearing another winter would bring famine. Children raised in starving camps grew into adults who distrusted abundance, never sitting at a table without remembering nights of empty plates. This culture of preparedness, born from hunger, became part of the pioneer ethic: thrift, caution, and suspicion of waste. The memory of loss was equally powerful. Cemeteries across the Midwest and Great Plains filled with graves marked "Died in winter," entire rows of small headstones for children. These markers became silent teachers, warning future generations of the costs of miscalculation. Families told and retold stories of the winters that took their kin. The winter of the big snow, the year of the cough, or the hard winter of 1880 to 81 became historical anchors, shaping how communities measured time itself. Indigenous peoples carried parallel legacies, though marked by displacement and policy-driven scarcity. Winters that once tested resilience became deadly when bison herds collapsed and reservations offered little food or fuel. Oral traditions recall hunger winters, seasons when children starved and ceremonies shifted from celebration to survival. These memories became part of collective identity, reminding communities of both resilience and injustice. The legacy of hunger for native nations was not only survival, but also the trauma of dispossession. Economically, winters reshaped settlement patterns. Families who endured repeated hardships often abandoned marginal lands, retreating to valleys or towns where survival was more secure. Others invested in stronger barns, larger food stores, and networks of trade, slowly building resilience into communities. By the late 19th century, railroads and commerce mitigated some risks, but memories of famine drove demand for grain elevators, cooperatives, and better infrastructure. Hunger taught settlers that survival required collective systems, not just individual grit. Culturally, the winters fed into the mythology of the frontier. Popular accounts celebrated endurance, transforming tragedy into proof of toughness. The Donner Party, though remembered for cannibalism, also became a symbol of determination. The Mormon handcart survivors were honored within their community as martyrs of faith. Frontier newspapers retold stories of families who endured storms with little more than prayer, shaping public perception of pioneers as resilient, almost heroic figures. Yet these narratives often obscured the suffering itself. glossing over starvation and despair in favor of triumph. Literature and folklore kept the memories alive. Laura Ingalls Wilder's The Long Winter, based on the 1880 to 81 Dakota blizzards, depicted the grinding monotony of hunger, the fear of snowbound towns, and the relief of eventual rescue. While written decades later, it reflected real memories passed down through families. Stories of wolves, blizzards, and frozen rivers entered folk memory, told to children not only as entertainment, but as warnings about nature's power. The psychological legacies were harder to measure, but no less real. Survivors carried trauma in silence. Men who lost families to blizzards often left their land, unable to face reminders. Women who buried children sometimes never recovered, their grief shaping entire households. Children who survived winters of famine often became adults with deep-seated anxieties about scarcity. These unspoken wounds shaped frontier culture as much as visible scars. For indigenous nations, the legacy was compounded by systemic loss. Winters of hunger reinforced mistrust of us promises as rations failed and treaties broke. Oral histories remember government agents withholding food, leaving families to starve while supplies sat locked in warehouses. These memories carried into later generations, fueling resistance movements and shaping political identity. Hunger became not only a seasonal hardship but a symbol of betrayal. The legacies of ice and hunger also altered landscapes. Forests near settlements were stripped bare for firewood. Game populations declined as desperate hunters pursued them through winters. Fields flooded by thaw bore scars for years, reshaping farming practices. Even cemeteries left physical marks. Small hilltop plots where families buried their dead became permanent reminders of winters past. Despite the suffering, the legacies were not solely grim. They also produced innovations. Settlers developed new preservation methods, building ice houses and experimenting with canning. Communities organized cooperatives to store and distribute grain. Churches and charities expanded their roles, creating early systems of mutual aid. These adaptations laid foundations for broader social safety nets in the decades to come. Winter forced invention, and hunger compelled cooperation by the early 20th century. Technological progress, railroads, telegraphs, better stoves, and commercial farming reduced the risks of isolation and famine. Yet memories of the frontier winters remained vivid. Elderly pioneers recounted them to children, emphasizing the hardships that shaped their lives. In many families, these stories became origin myths, proof of endurance and sacrifice. They reinforced a cultural narrative that hardship was the price of progress, and survival the measure of worth. The legacy of ice and hunger is therefore twofold. On one hand, it reveals the human cost of expansion, lives lost, families shattered, communities scarred. On the other, it underscores resilience, the ability of settlers and indigenous peoples to endure, adapt, and carry forward lessons etched in suffering. Both truths exist together, inseparable in the story of the frontier today. As history reflects on westward expansion, the mythology of abundance cannot be told without acknowledging the winters that tested its reality. The frontier was not only fields of wheat and open skies. It was also cabins buried in snow, children lost to fever, and families haunted by hunger. The legacies of ice and hunger endure as reminders that progress is never without cost, and that survival, in the end, is the deepest mark of history.